Well, thanks for probably cutting your lunch short and missing out on that beautiful sunshine out there. Appreciate it. If my panel could just introduce themselves, their backgrounds, and maybe share perspective from where you'll be offering your insights on these questions.
Sure, I can start. Mark Christopherson, longtime Medtronic employee, early founder of Inspire Medical, and early in my VP of R&D phase, and then now second-time CEO of a company that's a spin-off out of Deerfield Catalyst.
I'm Zoar Engelman. I'm Chief Science Officer of Deerfield Catalyst and also of Caridia. Those are medical device incubators, so we spin off companies and hire people like Mark Christopherson to run them, and give my perspective from the founder angle, as well as being an employee at one of those companies and having a new CEO come in.
Hi, everyone. I'm Terri Burke. I'm a venture partner with Epidarex Capital, where I lead the medtech practice. I'm also a startup co-founder and CEO. I did that for 5 years, so I've been on the startup side of things, and I have an operating background. I was on the senior leadership team at Edwards Life Sciences for over a decade, so I think I can bring some unique perspectives from a couple of different approaches.
Super. So let's start out with a stat just to set this up. An HBS study showed that when the CEO remained constant, senior level management turnover was 16% annually. 8.5% of that was voluntary and 7.5% was involuntary. In the case where the CEO changed and an internal executive moved to the top slot, the involuntary leadership jumps to 12.5% from 7.5%, and that's an increase of about 65%. And then a greater disruption occurs when a new leader comes from outside, which generally happens in only mid-performing and low-performing firms, hence the CEO replacement. As high-performing firms almost never replace their CEOs. The turnover averaged 26%, almost 4 times the rate when the CEO did not change. So those are substantial stats, whether it's a small cap or a large company. So in the audience here today, we have a lot of individuals who might be first-time CEOs or founders. And statistically speaking, 80% of them are going to get replaced. So, surprise. We had chatted about this earlier, Terri. That replacement, how do you think about handling that? And as an investor, how during the investment process, the diligence process, do you crack that question to the potential founder CEO that this is likely to happen statistically?
It's a good question. Well, first I would say, if you're a founder CEO and there's a replacement plan, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're not performing well or starting a company up in a positive way. It may mean that your company is grown and graduated and needs some different skill sets. But from the investment perspective, we think a lot about team. We invest at the seed and A stage, so we often are working with founders, scientists, physicians, and they're very important at that phase of a company, right? You really can't build a technology or a company without really strong scientific and medical expertise. So it's often an advantage for the company early on. But if we see that the individual maybe has some of those important qualities, but maybe not the ones we want to see longer term in terms of board management, understanding how to fundraise, handling a lot more of the diversity of a role like CEO. As investors, we may have that conversation very early before we agree to invest so that we're aligned. And we can say, hey, this A stage makes a lot of sense for you, but we'd like to see a transition plan or be clear about that. Sometimes if we start a company early enough with a founder, we'll help recruit the CEO at the same time. But I would say in general, VCs wait too long to change CEOs to see the technologies grow and the companies grow.
I want to come back to that statement as well. Mark, your insights on that as far as how do you handle that conversation with the incoming CEO? And in fact, did you have that conversation as you just got moved into the role?
Yeah, I changed CEO roles about a year ago, and it was the type of thing we graduated to the point of preclinical where it was, okay, we're ready to hire more of the commercial side of people, marketing, early sales type of thing. So it was, do I hire those people, or does the new candidate coming in hire their team so they can pick their people versus if I hire them, they're now, stuck with that group of people that I brought in. At the same time, the culture changes at that point too. Now you're looking at more of a commercial organization. The people that were early startup people tend to, decide if they want to stick around or if they're moving to another early stage startup.
Zoar?
Yeah, I think to reflect on what Terry and Mark are saying, the medical device companies go through kind of natural transition phases, from the very beginning, start of the napkin, through initial de-risking to larger clinical trials, regulatory, and ultimately commercial. And the kind of talent and people that are good at one phase aren't necessarily the same group that's good at the next phase. And I think deep down, most of those people realize that, and people stay too long, including management team, et cetera, they become kind of unhappy with the trajectory. They sort of end up realizing it sometimes the hard way. There's sort of this ownership feel that when you start a company or you've been at a company for a long time, you want to see it through, you feel like it's your baby. But very frequently, you're better off having new babies and letting somebody more professional take care of your old one.
Oftentimes, too, it's funny you use the word baby. Those founders, and usually they're CTOs turned CEOs, don't want to be told that their baby's ugly. And it is ugly, especially when you're running through the earlier stages. Terri, you had mentioned that we usually wait too long. Give me some examples that you've experienced, as well as what you watch from the sidelines as to when were the triggers and when should they have made the move?
No, it's a good question. I would say sometimes as a venture capitalist, when we're listening to pitches and a company has moved maybe beyond the seed or the A round, or they're really moving towards the next inflection point, there is a subtle difference in the pitches that a person who's come up through the business side or marketing or sales has versus someone who's more technical or a physician, for example. So you can see that the creativity that's needed to approach the value proposition in the market isn't quite there. So that's one thing we see that we can identify and say, I wonder if there's a transition plan in place, or how is this individual surrounding herself or himself with the right leadership team to fill in some of those capabilities, because that's another way to do it. But in terms of being late, I mean, one of the challenges is that when you're at a seed or an A round, like I said earlier, that founder person who's got that technical and medical or clinical background is really valuable. And so they may be able to raise an A round, but increasingly as you get to the bigger rounds, the team needs to look different. And so it becomes this chicken and the egg problem of, does the company have enough money in the bank to attract a new CEO, or do you need to raise that next round in order to get that transition CEO? And companies sometimes fall in that valley where they're really struggling, and if they're really trying to fundraise and they have an interesting idea, but they're just not getting the interest they want, sometimes with VCs it can be team that the VCs are hesitant on, and it's a lot of work for a VC to put out a term sheet and then have to manage a CEO transition. So sometimes VCs will just wait and see what happens versus investing. So if you struggle to raise capital, really look at your team and say, what are our skills and capabilities? Do we have gaps? And how can we fill that with the cash we have?
Zoar, from your perspective, what signals have you seen that you just know that CEO should have been replaced, but what has been the barrier to replacement oftentimes?
So, as founders, I think Deerfield Catalyst, Caridia, we take a fairly unique approach. We have we're all serial entrepreneurs, but instead of singular founders, we have a team around it. So medical, science, technology, finance. And so we take this strong approach of basically working together to advance a company as far as it can before, we believe it's headed in the right direction. Our delays in hiring CEOs have usually come in finding really the right fit for that company and identifying the need, whether it's regulatory, commercial, or even that CEO's experience and sort of cultural fit with the team. And so where we've delayed and, as an incubator, we've been able to keep companies sort of moving forward in the correct way until we found that person. But when we do find the right person for the phase, so Mark Christopherson is an example of one of our latest spinouts, we find that we transition to that person, very quickly and efficiently.
But do you find yourself, and again, that's a little bit of a different construct with Catalyst, you find yourself, and I run across this when we get calls on that, I've got somebody moving into a B round or C round, it's a clinical lift with a commercial build, or at least a go-to-market strategy, and we've only got enough runway in the bank for 8 months. And we want a CEO who either can raise the money and who's crazy enough to come in with 8 months left, or do we sit in the pocket with the person we've got? And that I wonder what goes through the mind of the investors.
Yeah, I think we talked earlier about the board interaction with the CEO, right? And getting, open communication, maybe a board chair that can kind of lead that discussion with the CEO. I think it's important to have that transparent communication. And maybe it's not all the way down to the full team, but at least that the CEO and the board are in alignment with like, okay, where are the gaps and what's the right transition point to hand this off to the next CEO so that we, don't lose talent and we kind of maximize the success of the company by doing it that way.
Have anybody on the board, I ran through this very recently, replacement of a CEO, and the board did not believe that there'd be any attrition once that founder / charismatic / team builder for what was in there today was going to be let go. And the board thought that the rest of the organization was mature enough and professional enough not to leave. So other than being hallucinatory, how would you manage that if that was your investment and you were lead on that?
Why don't you start and then I'll...
Yeah, I think for me, it's like it's making sure the team is aware that this is a successful transition. There is going to be some social capital, right? That you've got the culture that the first CEO brought in. People really like that culture. They came to work for that CEO. So now it's a change. I think if you can somehow transition the team, not rip the Band-Aid off, but somehow bring them in, okay, over the next 6 months, there'll be a transition. They can warm up to that transition. And then making sure there's some sticky factor with the new CEO, give that person time to acclimate, because it doesn't happen overnight. It really is a 6-month process.
Our companies are usually a little bit earlier in that they're still building out their team and they're hiring. So I think the comment was made by Mark earlier that allowing a new CEO to make the hires is important. But we've had scenarios where, a founder has raised a first round of capital and then feels very good having done that. And through the CEO process can actually be a little problematic in that it's easy to poke holes in all the things that you think a potential candidate doesn't have. And so we've had one where we actually asked the founder to step out of the recruiting process and allow the board only. We had started saying it would be great to have this founder early on meeting the candidates, but we found it was distracting and that the founder really wasn't able to think about how a person could complement the skills that the founder had and instead was really looking for reasons not to hire someone. So I think it can go both ways, that you can stymie a process or you can struggle to retain talent.
So are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we found that, there's sort of two approaches, and we also transition early stage. And I hope we do a nice job with welcoming and transitioning the CEO, although Mark may say differently. But I think, getting the employees involved, especially those early employees who, they may be the first 5 people, and, you're going to hire another 15, 20 plus people in the next couple of years. But actually getting them kind of bought in as a critical stakeholder into the process, I think can really help smooth that transition over. That we've had instances both ways where employees were sort of more involved in, their feedback was actually heard by the hiring group. And there are other cases where, the board really selects somebody that they think is right, and they really didn't get feedback or really understand the operation of the company enough to be sensitive to what people wanted and the kind of cultural fit.
It can be a hard conversation too with the founder who's done great work, right? Come up with a really innovative technology, understands the clinical condition well. But I think being open as a founder to the importance of staying on. For us at Epidarex, we love it when our founders remain part of the company, but maybe it's in a science role or a technology role or a medical officer role. So we're rarely looking to completely remove someone. It's just to allow the team, the management team, to expand and grow and be stronger. But I think sometimes those are hard conversations. So I wish VCs would do it earlier and often. But I also would say if you're out there as a CEO, don't be afraid to ask that question of a potential VC that's looking at you. I think it shows a lot of maturity. I think it shows a lot of forward thinking. And you might end up with a really nice dialogue that ultimately allows your company to succeed.
So that sets up another question after this one. They're related. Why is it that almost without exception, when a board chooses to replace the CEO, they bring a new CEO in, process goes pretty well, and they basically say, here's the keys, there's the sandbox, go get them, and there's no legitimate transition plan, nor follow-up at 60 days, 90 days, 180, without having a coach in there, when you could be looking at 10, 15, 40, 60 million, and a coach could run you maybe 50,000 for the season, that would ensure your investment in a lot better way than if you didn't. And I'm confounded after 32 years in search that I've not seen it done more than once. Mark?
Yeah, I think even for the whole team, a coach is needed to transition, right? I think, really just kind of.
It's not just for the CEO,
Yeah,
it goes both
facilitate the whole
ways.
team, what are their emotions with the change and managing through the change to make sure that those people stay committed to the company and make it through that to the other side and don't leave the company. And I think for the new CEO, it's also very difficult because they're, handed the keys, but they don't know which key works on what and have to learn all that, quickly. So I think having someone facilitate that between the prior CEO, new CEO, and team, which is an important factor of it, and board. I think getting the board acclimated with the new CEO is also an important changeover point.
So Terri, how come you don't do that?
Yeah. So I think a couple of reasons. One, sometimes it's cash. I mean, quite honestly, especially if you're at a seed or a small A round. I think sometimes it's about the experience on the board. So if you have just institutional investors on your board, they've seen a lot, but maybe not necessarily been in the trenches in an operating role. So sometimes I think VCs think they can be that coach and they can navigate, which can be harder sometimes for a board to be interacting with employees of a CEO and trying to figure out what's going on. That's a bit of a challenge. So I would actually argue for at least 1 to 2 operating people on board to provide that perspective that, hey, it's money well spent. It's $50,000 on, maybe $40 million raised. So I think sometimes it's just, we talk about the experience we want in the leadership team, but are we really thinking enough about what do we want on a board? Because when things are going really well in the marketplace, I would argue a board is not necessarily super active or needed in an everyday manner. But when markets are hard, like they have been in the last 18 months, suddenly boards are overwhelmed with work. And it's a lot harder, and then you find your board is lacking the skill sets you need.
And in this environment, and we'll put this in your lap, Zoar, I find oftentimes board members have way too many boards they sit on. They're distracted. And it's the biggest fire of the week that gets the attention. And so, Zoar, what have you seen, and then the rest of the panel here, are there too many board seats for board members right now?
I think, not being a VC or having to sit on multiple boards may be a difficult question to answer, but I think what we see is, I think to reflect on what Terri was saying, having board members with operational experience, everyone who's operated a startup or a business unit at a bigger company, they have seen multiple fires across their entities under their control, and they sort of are accustomed to dealing with it from an operational perspective, not one that's purely financial. And where we've seen success in the past is actually having a very strong chairman of the board with operational background not necessarily being an involved board member, I don't know what it's called, but a board member is like working closely, but really one that can sort of guide the rest of the board on plan of action, can advise practically with the CEO on how to sort of navigate those difficult waters. We found that to be very, very beneficial in our companies.
With more and more technology coming out of Europe, coming out of Israel, coming out of the UK, that is ideated there and then is onshored here because this is the big market that most of them want to have to go after. And typically comes out earlier than usual, maybe even preclinical. Cultures are tremendously different. What of your, and Zoar, you and I just got back from Israel, and we had these conversations with a couple of VCs there, and they're sort of getting it now. What do you watch for? What guidance could you give about that sort of cultural shift that is dramatic, where the essence of the technology is OUS, yet the clinical, regulatory, and go-to-market is going to be here in the US?
I think that, and especially reflecting on our trip to Israel and sort of the great innovation that's coming out of there, that, and it goes back to what we were saying, that at different stages of a company, CEO, founder has a very strong role to play. And that role can continue, but, the hard thing is really to have that frank conversation with that individual and say, the time to transition out from, where you were and where you want to go is probably now. And in the ideal case, of course, they can remain involved on a technical side or even sort of a morale side, in terms of mission of the company and kind of guiding principles in a way of the effort. But I think I think a lot of the geographies, I guess, where it's perceived as maybe founders to be a problem, are also geographies that are, kind of respect frank conversations with people. So I think having those difficult, frank conversations will probably be welcomed, although difficult, and can ultimately lead the company in the right direction.
Terri, your experience in that area?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, I think the themes are the same, though. Those early conversations, those frank conversations, planning ahead. So if you're founding a company and you want to see it succeed in 5 or 7 years, map that out. By year 3, what do you need? That might be new talent, or will you pick this up by a consulting agreement, or do you really need a full-time person? I think the themes are the same, but culture matters, and I think Mark has experience with kind of culture changes and what that looks like and how you have to navigate it.
Mark, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, culture is really what drives, success in a company, right? That can-do culture to get a very small team to do, mountainous projects, right? And so that's really, I think, the founding CEO's job to build that culture. And that, you can do a lot with a small team when you have a very, focused group that all has each other's backs and works very hard together. And that culture is probably at risk when you do the transition. That's probably the biggest risk I see when you transition CEOs. The employees are all thinking, okay, how's the culture going to shift? And I think a very concerted effort to maintain the culture wherever possible, but the company is growing, right? Some people, want to work for a small company, don't like the medium-sized company, right? So, but I think managing through that, maybe with an external consultant that would come in and help, how do we set up things so that they, as much as possible, maintain a culture that people want to stay with, is important.
As you transition management into a new management team, it might be a single person or a group of people, what does that communication cadence need to be? Not nice to have. And then how does it appear? Is it a one-pager every week for the first 8 weeks, then going to every 3 weeks? What does that look like? Has anybody enacted that mechanism in place? Red light, green light, yellow light, this is where we have our problems. This is what we've got under construction. So Zoar, you want to?
Yeah, I think, when we bring on a CEO, it's sort of we lay out the status of the company, where there needs to be hires. We feel very strongly that as much as possible, new CEOs should bring on their team to fill gaps, and you should not sort of burden them with hire for them or even sign large service kind of contracts, on their behalf. As much as possible, you should let that person. But, what we've done in the past is, And what we do now is really have regular conversations daily, weekly, several times a week early on. Make sure that person knows, get involved in early meetings, and sort of, the team is sort of, you have to prep the people in the company that, somebody's coming in and they're the right person, and you really need to own that transition of leadership and make your people feel very comfortable that who's coming in is the right person for the company and will sort of lead it in a positive direction and help that company achieve its kind of goal.
We've used a little bit of a maybe hybrid approach, so not hiring coaches. Again, we're pretty early, and usually cash is a limitation, but on the boards where we do have someone with operating experience, sometimes we provide a short-term consulting type role for a board director with an operating experience to work directly with the CEO and be that coach and that early voice for a transition, and to be checking in. So less formal than, the full check-in, red light, yellow light, green light, but someone on the board to kind of own that piece for a period of time. I've seen that work well, and I've seen it get extended longer than maybe it needs to as well. So, again, I think with the planning is, you can bring someone in or put someone in that role, but how do you sunset it? Like, when do you know it's done? And sometimes I think that's hard, and then over time you can have a familiarity where you're not getting the right feedback to the individual because there's such a close working relationship. So I think the planning piece is probably what we're not so good at.
Yeah, I think as a new CEO coming in, it's been a great transition for me coming on board with the DFC, Deerfield Catalyst team. They've been really gracious. It's their baby that they're handing off, right? So being aware of that. But I think then lots of communication, the first months, having a one-on-one with individual board members, just to kind of get their pulse on things and learn from them. And then, weekly meetings. We had weekly meetings, but those kind of slowly fell off where, not as necessary, but it's still great to have the broader founding team involved with the company. And it's great to know that I can call them up at any point and say, hey, we have a question for you, or how'd you guys come up with this answer? Or, and it's great to have that history with the project long term. And they're still our biggest cheerleaders, which is great. So. Yeah.
So I know in the audience there are probably some CEOs that have a question newly minted. I know I've got one great one here I want to ask him about, who's taken over the helm twice in companies in transition, his leadership. But first, before any questions at all that anybody has at all for the panel right now? Todd Usen, call you out. You're always great for this. Todd, so you moved in out of an Olympus presidency to Active Surgical, and then now over to another publicly traded company. Tell us about what you've learned, one as a president of a large corporate entity, and then into a very small startup. Can I get him a mic? And then the move now to a public company. And what were the best of, and other than where you are right now, what was not the best of?
Sure. Thank you. And entertaining the crazy recruiting firm that pulled me out of this big, huge company that I had the opportunity to run at, $4 billion P&L at a nice company, brought me onto the startup world with 5 months before they needed to raise, and I said yes. So that's my own fault, but I really believe in the technology, and I believe in the firm that puts you in place. What I learned quickly is no matter how great my investors were, and they really were, and they helped me get other investors, they gave me great advice, without an independent board member, it'll fail. Because no matter what, at the end of the day, you still all get judged like a CEO gets judged to produce numbers. Investors get judged to protect their money and make sure it grows. Doesn't matter. So if you're not there tomorrow, they still have an investment in the company. Having operators on the board, I think, is critical. But not even a little critical, really critical, because it's a really lonely job being a CEO if you don't have someone that you can go confide in. And the confiding, I trusted all of my investors because they trusted me. So don't get me wrong, it's really a good relationship, but someone that's also just run a business. Now, there are great investors that had the opportunity to also run a business and be an operator. I'd go to them in a second. So from a CEO perspective, it's almost like instead of putting a coach down to help the CEO. I almost wanted to put a coach on the board to help the board. And I don't mean it with disrespect. I really mean it, to me, it made a big difference. I was not as successful in my first go-around because, unfortunately, everybody, even the person you bring in as an operator, loved the company so much they invested. And I'll take their money, but now they're an investor too. So anyway, but moving from startup, there's certain phases, and one thing I absolutely agree with is there's leaders that can take a company because they're great founders. I was blessed. I had a surgeon-founded company, had no desire to be a CEO, so I was brought in as the first CEO. Then it works. Problem is, you still sometimes get to that point that there's still, like you said, Zoar, that they still want to have their hands in everything over time, and they're a wonderful person and great tech. But as you're growing, their vision gets farther and farther, or the company goes farther and farther from their vision sometimes because of logic and maybe the way that you have to run a company. And then you still have to make those decisions of how do we slowly wean, a brilliant surgeon off of your day-to-day operations. So those are the toughest parts, but worth it. Moving to a publicly traded company, I moved to a publicly traded CEO role with the knowledge that I can say this now, that I needed to take the company private because it didn't deserve to be public. It's, I was wasting my time in earnings reports and doing all this thing because we weren't big enough to be public. But it's now, you allows ourselves to do the things we need to do. So grass is always greener sometimes. You jump at something, but jump at it for the right reasons. And if you have a great relationship that you put your CEO in place, that makes a big difference. So it's not my panel, so.
No, but
You can join.
You have a very unique perspective on moving into 2 CEO slots, and that sets up my question. Was there a question, hand up back there? So there's no CEOs back there who were just wondering if the targets on their back is hot red or is just not lit yet? Okay. So what if a CEO comes to you, it's a first-time CEO or a CEO in general, and says, I want an independent board member on somebody, as Todd had pointed out, and I think we chatted about even before the session, and that was not a plant, by the way. So what if a CEO comes to you and says, listen, the construct of the board seems really great. However, I'm not sure that is best for me as your CEO. What would you do?
I would love that if a CEO really had that foresight to think through what could make that individual more successful or the company more successful. From an Epidarex standpoint, we always welcome that, and we're always looking for the independent board director, and we're looking for the operating experience. But what I will say quite candidly is it may come down to who the investors are and who has voting rights. And so we may want to have an independent director, but we may not be able to accomplish that. We may not be able to accomplish changing out a CEO. So I would say when you're raising your capital, really know who you're taking money from and what the structure of the deal is and who owns the votes.
So let me put a scenario forth here. It might seem like a silly question. I get calls very often on a weekly basis from CEOs or operators who say, I'm either retiring, moving out, and if you know any board roles or advisory roles that could use somebody like me. And they want very little compensation, but they want intellectual jousting, and they want to offer value back to the medtech industry. What would be the resistance to doing that as an independent advisor? Zoar, throw it to you.
Well, one thing that we like to think of ourselves as sort of responsible founders. So we've, at least in the last few ventures, we have had the opportunity to fill an independent board role, but have delayed filling that role until we brought on a CEO, so that person can identify, the sort of appropriate fit for, maybe what they lack, or at least the kind of advice they want to get. In general, I think the idea, you want to bring on somebody. I think the intellectual jousting is right on, that you want somebody that you can talk to openly, critically. You have investors in your board, and to a large extent, you have to manage them. And it's really difficult. You don't have the sort of open relationship frequently with the people who are putting money and who are putting their jobs on the line, and as partners or principals or whatever in the VC or whatever they are. But having that independent person is really important. Maybe the only person you can really talk to on the board.
Yeah, I think for me, just having a good relationship with every board member on the board on a one-on-one basis really helps a lot. and really just getting to know people on the board so you can have a call with them and discuss different topics without the broader board. I think one of the things that's worked well, that I've seen work well, is board observers have played a role. Maybe it's a strategic board observer, or it's a investor that doesn't have enough shares to have a vote, but sometimes those individuals play a nice kind of equalizing role, kind of managing maybe a board member that's a little harder to work with, or providing feedback behind the scenes that helps the CEO be successful. So.
But it may be hard. I mean, quite honestly, there's a limited number of seats. So if you start at the early stage seat or A, your board's maybe 5 people. So you've got a common seat, you've got a CEO seat, you have maybe 2 investors, so you call it your A round. So maybe there's 1 seat. So that's a little bit of the problem. There aren't that many opportunities, and an investor might need to take a step back and give up a seat for the benefit of the company, and that rarely happens. So I have one that I'm an independent director on, that the A-round investors, the lead, asked me to take it because they wanted operating experience. That's happened once. So it's not common. And so I think that's a little bit of the challenge of, not all investors really weigh that independent seat or operating experience the same. And so that may be hard in your example for someone to find those seats.
Or you could find a great CEO coach, spend the $50,000, keep your board seat, and ensure outcome of a successful CEO.
Yeah, hire that person to be your
There
coach.
you go, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time here. Thank you so much for your time after lunch. And I'd like to thank my panel as well, please.